Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible. This is a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and I'm joined by three individuals of archaeological fame and interest. Dr. Larry Geraty, co-host of this program, long-time investment of your life in archaeology, still going in many ways, and you are helping archaeologists now succeed and to grow because of your work with advancement at La Sierra University. Dr. Warren Trenchard is the director of graduate programs at La Sierra University in the Divinity School, and also in the Divinity School, Kent Bramlett, Associate Professor of Archaeology in the History of Antiquity and Chair of the Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology. So, interests across the board in archaeology and in Scripture. We turn on this episode of Excavating the Bible to a book that has always struck me as a bit unusual for the New Testament. The book of Hebrews, the letter, the epistle to the Hebrews. Initial reactions to this book. How does it come across, just initially to you?
You know, in seminary, we read it because of its beautiful Greek and the way the book is structured and so on. It's a little different from a lot of the other letters we've been talking about.
Right. What do you think?
Well, the arguments are very different, aren't they, from the books that we've been working through here? It's a very different approach, more of a rabbinic approach to Old Testament narrative and stories. One has to do a major shift somewhere in the reading of it, but I think it's been a very important component of the New Testament, and sometimes the center of some controversy. But it's well worth spending some time with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, Doug, I found it interesting that you kind of equivocated between letter and epistle on this. This is a good one to raise that kind of issue, I think. We have talked about in the past about other letters of the New Testament, which are very much occasional pieces that address specific issues in the life of some person or in the life of a community, and is addressed by a Christian leader. Most of the letters of the New Testament are associated with the name of Paul, the apostle, who was the founder of many of these churches. This letter is also associated with the name of Paul, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But it is not quite like the others in that the same address of circumstances and issues and so forth. But there is nonetheless, embedded in all of the intricate theology of this letter, an ultimate pastoral concern. There's a group of people who are a bit mysterious to us as we read this book, who are on the verge of backsliding or abandoning their faith or making some major negative adjustment in their spiritual lives and in the life of their communities. And so this document is written to address that.
Anonymously, right?
It's written anonymously. There's no little letter formula at the beginning that we find in the other texts. It simply starts out with a kind of declaration. It's a rhetorical masterpiece in many respects. And it's probably for good reason then, near the end of it, the writer describes what he or she is doing as a word of exhortation. So what we may be looking at here, interestingly enough, is kind of the transcript of a speech or a sermon to a group of people. It was obviously sent out to somebody, but its origin may not have been as a literary kind of thing like the other letters of the New Testament.
Well, you've teased us with a number of issues in your comments, and we want to come back to those. I mean, I don't think we understand the book of Hebrews, epistle of Hebrews, that we probably don't understand that as well without that kind of internal assessment. And then what, of course, we want to do here is talk about archaeological connections too. We do have some artifacts on the table in front of us. Kent, do we have some ceramics over there? Larry is going to be thinking glass and is going to be thinking I don't know, more elite. I don't know, maybe that would be more daily life for everybody. This would maybe moving toward more elite. And then there are some metal things here. So Kent, what do we have?
We've talked about how this is so Roman, right? We find it all across the Roman Empire. This kind of pottery with the ribbing on it, these thin wall. It's the same pretty much everywhere. A word comes to mind, metonymy. We sometimes identify an object with an identity. And I could ask the question then, when I find this Roman-style pottery, are we talking about Romans? Yeah. Roman people?
Yeah.
When we excavate a house with this type of pottery or a tomb, and this is in it, were those Romans? Metonymy, identification of a cultural artifact with an identity. Maybe we should ask the same thing about blue jeans. Do we find Americans everywhere we find, is everybody who wears blue jeans an American?
Right.
Or they were invented in California, are they Californians? No. In this case, I think cultural identity has so permeated the first century, this time period, that everybody was adopting these sorts of cultural artifacts around the Western world, the circum-Mediterranean Roman Empire.
But blue jeans do belong to an era, not before, but now, right? So it does have
tells us a
chronological.
lot, sure.
Yeah, it does tell us.
It tells
a lot,
us
right.
about the dominance of Western culture,
Culture.
even American culture.
And I think that's a very
defining
good, way to talk about the Roman Empire, because obviously the Romans conquered many, many different kinds of people, but their culture went with the armies and spread. And so that's why you get similar pottery, even though it was the Gauls and the North Africans who were using that pottery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Could you maybe be a little bit more accurate by saying Roman period family use these materials?
Yes, I think that would be appropriate. And again, it takes a little while for the conquered lands to
adopt
this, but we see that certainly in elite contexts everywhere, whether Jewish homes or, British, Brito-Roman homes in England.
Larry.
Well, we did talk about the common wares that belong to just about everybody. It was a little more elite to have glass because it was more expensive and a little harder to get. And when it comes to metal objects, certainly here you had the government involved in issuing those. And so that was perhaps the most expensive. But anyway, glass is still ubiquitous in the Roman world. It comes into fashion in the Hellenistic period, the time the Greeks had influence, and then rose to its height in the Roman and on into the Byzantine period. So we do find ceramics and glass, for instance, whenever we're working in the classical period in Palestine.
And these things put together, including what I'm going to talk about, by Christina Reed, who is assistant curator of our collections at the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. We have to keep thanking her because of the work she puts into this. But she and a team of volunteers are going through, I think they've made it, most of the way through the Roman glass collection that we have?
I think they're moving on to coins.
And they're on to coins now, and I think we have about 1,100 coins. So they will be busy curating these, recording all of the data about them.
And someday we hope that we're going to have a nice museum in which people can come to the campus of La Sierra University and see these things exhibited.
Right. And we will create a context here for
We will.
Good speech. Good speech, our chief advancement officer for the new museum. I mean, we are working on it currently.
We are.
With a new board and so on, and so very good point. As we move down the table further, some metal items here, the helmet. We see that over and over in New Testament literature. Physically, and Warren talks about this. This is a helmet. This was used in some sort of context that the military would use it.
So we can talk about the helmet of salvation, right?
And then we go to the metaphorical and talk about it there too. And then some lamps, typical of New Testament period Palestine, and a couple of small metal pieces too. So people pretty much around the Mediterranean world would know what these are, especially, Kent, as you've talked about this spreading out, either through military conquest or trade as it develops and so on. coming out of Pax Romana, coming out of the peace of Rome. So we have ubiquitous. Everything is ubiquitous. Everything's everywhere. So you can go to Morocco, to places like Volubilis, a Roman settlement, and you've got Roman pottery. You've got Roman wares.
Some of the best preserved Roman cities are in Libya, Algeria, Tunisia,
Syria.
Syria.
Okay, so we turn then to the book of Hebrews, and we will come at a number of different sorts of discussion points because it is different. It's a different kind of book. But we will do so by thinking again, as we always do, about the Roman Empire. Only one map this time, our standard one. What does this map mean now in the context of the book of Hebrews? We know what it would have meant if we were talking about the letters to the Thessalonians. We can put it on the map. What does it mean for the book of Hebrews? How do we think about this map, given the sorts of issues that our author is dealing with?
Well, Jews have certainly spread throughout this area. So wherever you find yellow, you tend to find Jewish immigrants who've gone there to make their living and left Palestine.
So, and that is called the Jewish
diaspora.
So the dispersion of the Jews. What kind of history could we put to this?
Well, I mean, the book of Hebrews speaks to someone well educated in Old Testament, and that would be primarily the Jews and maybe the God-fearers who worshiped with them. But in 49 AD, 49, the Roman Emperor Claudius, expelled the Jews from Rome. And it's thought that many of them made their way westward to Gaul, modern France. And historians of Jewish diaspora suggest this is really the beginning of the Ashkenazi presence in Western Europe through a series of migrations and further expulsions, migrating into Eastern Europe at some point, from Spain later, of course, into North Africa, becoming Sephardic Judaism. But we see then, through these sequences of expulsions and resettlements, Jewish communities developing in many locations across the Roman Empire. And they were usually well organized. I mean, they were literate. Romans tended to make use of the literacy of the Jews, as in later periods as well, for certain occupational tasks. Especially after the Roman Empire fell, this became very important because they were one of the few literate groups, so they became recorders of information, bankers, and so forth. But this letter then, Hebrews, no doubt went to many of these communities across the Roman Empire.
And this dispersion began much earlier than this time frame when this letter or document emerged. 5 or 6 centuries before the Christian era began. And that's true of settlements in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. 3 centuries, the 3rd century before Christ, there was already a movement to translate the Hebrew Bible into the language of most of these people. And this was done in Egypt, where they were speaking Greek. And so that really became the Bible of all of this Christian, or this Jewish diaspora, which is very interesting because when Paul began to move out among the countries and provinces of the Roman Empire, he first of all tended to touch down in these Jewish communities, and that became his base of operation in those regions, and found people who are already familiar with the concepts expressed in the Greek understanding of the Hebrew Bible.
How much impact comes from this diaspora in terms of, so the New Testament comes along, Paul and others are traveling, Pax Romana gives the routes, makes the routes available. How much of a role did the Jewish diaspora play in the way Christianity spread? Not just in how fast it spread, but just in the way it spread.
Well, it was the foundation, wasn't it? I mean, Jesus himself said, start here and then go further and then go to the ends of the world. And so Paul, in his mission, helped that to happen. And it probably couldn't have happened without the Roman Empire providing that, that peace and that trade and that travel and so on. And these Jewish communities that spread out were the first ones he went to. We know that from reading Acts. First, he would go to the Jews in the synagogue. Sometimes he would get thrown out, and then he would go wider, but they always started with the Jews.
We tend to understand the development of early Christianity throughout this period and throughout these regions as Palestinian Christianity. This is the first level. And then you have what emerges in an early conflict that is reflected in the early part of the book of Acts between these Hellenistic Christian leaders. They were Jews. And they spoke Greek. They had a broader understanding of mission to the non-Jews, and we refer to this as Hellenistic Jewish mission Christianity. And by the time you come into the latter part of the first century, this has become Gentile Christianity. So that's the transition that takes place in the first century. And we're looking at probably this document emerging somewhere towards the end of that whole Hellenistic Jewish expansion, Hellenistic Jewish mission Christianity. Paul was a leader in this because he was a Hellenist as well, coming from the diaspora himself. So he knew the language, he knew that way of understanding, and he had that commitment to a broader inclusiveness for the message that he was presenting.
And as Kent said, by the time the Jews were thrown out of Rome, Christians began to not want to be associated with these people that were in so much trouble in the Roman Empire. And so you begin to get a separation between the Jews and their Jewish religion, those who wanted to hang on to that, and the Jews and Gentiles who had become Christians, and they began to drift apart.
Rome's government officials scattered throughout into the provinces tended to encounter these Christians and view them as sects within Judaism. And you see them very often washing their hands, as it were, of these issues because they saw them as Jewish issues that were overall protected under Roman law. But when you come to an interesting incident of the fire in Rome that is sometimes attributed to Nero, Nero blamed the fire not on Jews, but on Christians. Right. And this is the first time you have that identification, not just the first sort of persecution that emerges out of that, but the first identification of Christians as separate entities from Jews.
Part of our context here. Well, then let's think about this, continuing our thinking about geopolitical. We have some Roman emperors. Would we date, we're going to come to the question of date for Hebrews. Would it be during these two Roman emperors listed or highlighted at the bottom?
Might even, yes, I would think it toward the end of Nero's time, maybe. We'll see what our New Testament expert says here, but I would think it would be just pre-70, but I may be wrong.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly, I don't think, would be earlier than Nero. I would venture at this point to say that.
Well, we will come back to that as in right now. When it comes to issues of dating and authorship and audience and so on, take us through some of the issues, Warren.
Well, let me talk a little bit about authorship first. This particular document is not too mysterious with regard to the question of authorship. Although it has been identified throughout the centuries of Christianity, often in relationship to Paul, and is so identified in the King James Version of the English Bible, Paul's name is never mentioned in it. There's no little letter writing formula at the beginning that identifies the writer. This is really an anonymous text. And the early Christians struggled over this. They recognized its importance, but they were committed to accepting into the pantheon of authoritative documents from early Christianity that they began calling the New Testament, only those writings that met certain standards, certain criteria. one of which was the standard of apostolicity.
Right.
That is, it had to be written by an apostle or an associate of an apostle. So they could justify anything that was associated with the name of Paul, even if Paul himself had not written it. But this letter is anonymous. Christians in the eastern part of the empire, particularly in North Africa, in Egypt, Alexandria in particular, identified with many of the concepts in this document. They were very much like a Jewish writer in their community called Philo back in the 1st century. And so they very much thought that this should be part of the New Testament, but they justified that by saying it was written by Paul. That's how they could, in fact, include it. Christians in the western part of the Roman Empire did not have that kind of commitment to this. They did not think it was Pauline, and they could not accept it into the New Testament. And so this went on for many centuries. It wasn't until the late 4th and, late 4th and into the 5th century that this became kind of reluctantly a consensus within Christian circles, that this was part of the New Testament, whether or not Paul was the author. Now, it does not sound like Paul. As Larry indicated, this is some excellent Greek. It's among the best Greek in the New Testament. Paul didn't write Greek that well. He was fluent in Greek, but he was not a fluent writer of technical Greek. This is technical Greek, and it approaches almost classical level at times. It's very good. The type of argumentation in the document is not Pauline. Some of the major Pauline themes and concepts are missing, and there are themes there that are not in Paul at all. Even Paul's use of Habakkuk 2:4 about the just shall live by faith is quoted in this document as well, but flipped on its head, it means something totally different. Faith there is not belief, but faith is faithfulness. And that's very important too as a focus of this letter. So this is not Pauline. It doesn't claim to be Pauline, but it has a legitimate part in being in the New Testament. And when was it written? Well, I'll just be brief on this, that the key to it is it just before or just after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple? The temple is never mentioned, and all references to Jewish religious, cultic services and so forth are centered around the wilderness tent or tabernacle, and not the temple in Jerusalem. So it's led some to believe the temple had already been destroyed. But it also focuses on sacrifices as something going on at the time, which would suggest the temple was there, but the author probably extending his line of thinking from focusing on Moses and on Joshua and the priesthood that started with Aaron and so forth, that he goes on to just describe the services then associated with the tent in their day. So I think it was written just before the destruction of Jerusalem.
I would agree with you. I mean, I think it would be astounding for them not to mention, the author not to mention the destruction of the temple when he's constantly arguing about how better these sacrifices are. Everything is better, better, better. If that was gone, certainly they would have mentioned it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Written perhaps in or directed to a particular part of the Roman Empire?
The only little clue we have on that, I mean, there's this clue you talked about of the Jewish diaspora. It could be written from and to anywhere in that world. But there is a little line toward the end of it that says, "Those in Rome send you greetings." Now, it's a little cryptic the way it actually reads. It seems to imply either those who are expatriates from Rome and living out somewhere else are sending greetings to their fellows. So Rome may be the place of destination for this, or it may, the area of around Rome in Italy may in fact be the origin of it. We don't know, but that's a little interesting clue nonetheless.
Okay. Well, let's look at some archaeological connections. An outline here suggests superiority. You actually, I heard a couple of references, Larry, you'd made, and that the role of Jesus is more superior than angels. The service is better. Everything is better.
everything that is important to Judaism, including the traditions about how the angels had their roles vis-a-vis Yahweh's interaction with his people, including giving of the law and so forth. The author here is declaring that the revelation in Christ is superior to the revelation in the prophets. It's superior to the role and function of the angels, superior to the activities and leadership of Moses and Joshua, and superior to the priesthood of the Levitical background, and particularly of Aaron. And there is when you come in with the justification that Jesus or Christ is from a different kind of priesthood altogether. So this mysterious figure from the story of Abraham, Melchizedek, comes in, as somebody who is a priest of God, but not one of the tribe of Levi. Jesus being from Judah, he can't be a priest then in a normal sense.
Okay.
And then finally, the services of all of these activities are inferior to the sacrifice of Christ himself.
A couple of more direct archaeological connections. Some symbols. I'm going to show a few slides very quickly. The first one's of Judaism, because we're talking about Judaism and Christianity, the interface, moving from one to the other, maybe back again. I think I heard you say that, Warren, we might have seen that. And then some symbols of Christianity. In Judaism, I'm going to Capernaum for all of these symbols. Kent, what's happening at Capernaum? What do we have here?
Well, we have a nice synagogue, probably built over the synagogue from the 1st century when Jesus preached in it. But this is a very ornate one. It has some beautiful symbols that are still preserved, and you can see when you visit. Here we have an ark that would be in a synagogue, the place where the Torah scroll is stored.
Right. Carved into what? Maybe an architrave or some kind of stone architectural
some
feature?
Architectural component. On the left, we have a menorah with the stand, the legs there, and an incense shovel to the left of it. Yeah. And on the right, an early occurrence of the 6-pointed star.
Right. So Judaism, Christianity. Larry, we've looked at this before.
Right. This is sort of a cartoonish way of depicting the crucifixion.
So not a positive image.
No,
This is
no.
sarcastic. And then we have from catacombs some of these symbols, like the fish, and this looks like a fish hook, although you reverse that a little bit and it becomes an anchor. That also is an early Christian symbol. And this one is interesting because you've got 3 symbols: an anchor on the left, the fish, and the chori, the chiro, the
Standing
Christ.
for Christ.
Right. So this interface between Christians and Jews certainly has to be at the core of what the book is about. And I think, Warren, you've talked a little bit about it. Anything that we want to add about this debate?
I would just simply say that I think this is a group, like a group of Jewish Christians who are apparently being tempted to fall back into Judaism. Right. And the writer is saying, don't do it.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible.